Professor Steve Garlick and Rosemary Austen from Possum Wood Wildlife Veterinary Hospital. So Professor Steve Garlick was a senior executive in the Commonwealth Public Service for 14 years, running a policy branch and then a division of 250 employees and providing policy advice to various ministers. For 20 years, he was a university professor in several universities, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and in semi-retirement continues as an honorary professor in the Centre for Compassionate Conservation at the University of Technology in Sydney. Steve has a PhD in economics and is a British Council scholar. He publishes in 3 areas: spatial economics, applied ethics, and wildlife behaviour. Founder of the Animal Justice Party, he was its president for 7 years and building an organisation of 6,000 members and having representatives elected to parliaments in New South Wales and Victoria. A consultant on higher education to the OECD and the Pascal International Observatory. He was also Vice President of the Australian Universities Community Engagement Alliance and has sat on several international boards. Steve is the co-founder of Possum Wood Wildlife, a charity organisation that rescues, treats and releases back to the wild injured, sick wildlife. He is also, since December 2020, the co-founder of Possum Wood Wildlife Veterinary Hospital. And Dr. Rosemary Austen's first degree included majors in chemistry, biochemistry and zoology, and her PhD was in biotechnology. She had 7 years of postdoctoral research in Canada and Australia in biotechnology, and for the past 27 years has been a GP in New South Wales and the ACT. Concurrently with working as a GP for the past 23 years, Rosemary has been a wildlife rescuer and rehabilitator, specialising in macropods, wombats and other species. Her main interest in this area is in rescuing, treating and rehabilitating macropod fence hangers and in macropod stress. With husband Steve, she runs the Possum Wood Wildlife Veterinary Hospital and Recovery Centre. So this leads us into our next presentation on quantifying post-traumatic stress in macropods and the polyvagal theory and therapy in stress rehabilitation.
We right? Okay.
Yep, all good. You can start when you're ready.
Okay, good, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to begin by sharing our respect for the first Australians, past and present, that occupy the land in which we are on. In our case here, it's the Wiradjuri people. The paper that we're going to present today is about life-threatening post-trauma stress in macropods. And we want to start the present. Here you've got the overview of what we want to talk about. The first point we want to give just a very brief overview is macropod emotions. Like all wildlife, they do have an emotional side, and it's important to know what these emotions are and be able to identify them, because they do relate to some past event that in fact cause the emotional reaction that you see. Important because they can give you the source of information to help in the recovery that you need to undertake. And the emotional life of an animal is just as important as his or her physical life. Now, when it comes to emotions, the emotional side and stress, veterinarians probably don't have the time to focus on that side of animals, but it's particularly important. And carers and rehabilitators in particular, who spend 24/7 with these animals, are in the best position really to understand the kinds of emotional states and stress in particular that these animals are going through. Now, to be able to do that effectively, we argue that you need to have what we call, or what Zygmunt Bauman calls a being for relationship. And that is a very close, meaningful, and caring relationship with the animal that you have that is going through recovery from it, or treatment and recovery from its injuries and the stress that it's under. Now, there's a whole range of behavioural indicators which give you a bit of a sense about what the stress is like, the kind of stress, but they are actually observable indicators, and we want to go a lot beyond that in this paper today. And this table here gives you the six neural states. We get that from Jacques Hengster, and then on our indications of what each of those neural states, how you can observe those for the animals that you have in your care, or even the animals in the wild, which you can spend some time with. So, but we want to go beyond the looking at the observed, and we want to come into some of the more quantitative aspects of stress and how we can use that in a way that helps the recovery of these animals. I'll bring on Rosemary now to take the next section, and then we'll be relaying this, and I'll do the next section after she's finished.
Hello to everyone from cold Canberra tonight.
I do not want to get sued.
We're sorry we couldn't make it over there on this occasion, but we had a bad virus in July, and we run quite a big recovery centre. So we have over 100 animals in care, so we can't be with you on this occasion. But I want to thank the organisers for allowing us to put out there some thoughts about this very important problem of stress and the myopathy syndrome that kills so many macropods. In fact, my interest started 23 years ago. We all remember our first joeys, and both my first joeys, Dasher and Rudy, died after being chased by two dogs on a 38-degree day. Rudy died very soon after the chase, and Dasher died a couple of months later with renal failure. And that's what triggered our interest in a former paper that we presented at one of these conferences on renal failure. But I've always had this interest in stress and myopathy, and how can we try and save these animals that seem to go into this relentless process of shutting down and finally death. So I'll just start with talking about some basic anatomy and physiology, because with stress, it's tied up very closely with the autonomic nervous system. So with our nervous systems, we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then you have the peripheral nervous system. One very important part of the peripheral nervous system is the voluntary or somatic nervous system, which is the one where, if, say I want to pick up the bottle of water, then I voluntarily pick up the bottle of water. So it's voluntary actions, whereas the autonomic nervous system, and especially the sympathetic nervous system, which is our surveillance system, they regulate the parts of the autonomic nervous system, regulate all the involuntary or the processes, body processes, such as they control temperature, heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, digestion. Now, there's two main parts to the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic, which is, you all would know as the fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic system, which is described as the rest and digest system. Okay. So with the sympathetic nervous system, it releases adrenaline, it stimulates the release of adrenaline. So the two parts, there's the initial adrenaline rush, and then there's the effects that are triggered by the sympathetic nerves themselves, which it's basically the sympathetic nervous system originates in the spinal cord. So it's a bit like a pain reflex, where if you put your hand on a hot stove, you immediately remove your hand. So the information goes into the spinal cord and straight back out again. And this is similar. The sympathetic nervous system, it picks up on danger before we even have a chance to think about it. So to be like me walking out the front door here in summer, and almost treading on a brown stake. I have an immediate reaction to protect myself, which I don't think about. So the information is picked up by the autonomic nervous system and acted on straight away. And there's a number of important effects, all which are pretty obvious. They're effects in the body that allow us to make our escape or fight for our lives. So they release glucose, which is the important energy source. They take blood away from the gut and kidneys and skin, where you don't need blood in those critical times. You need blood going to the brain, the heart, the lungs. It enhances blood flow to the muscles, 1200%, and to the lungs. Dilates the bronchioles, which are the small airways of the lungs, allowing better access of air down into the air spaces, so you get better oxygen transfer. Increases heart rate and the contractility of the heart cells, dilates cardiac blood vessels, dilates the pupils. And this is just a summary of the fight or flight response. You have the central nervous system, which in this case with the sympathetic nervous system is the spinal cord that triggers off this response. And you get initially you get information go to the adrenal medulla, and it releases adrenaline, and that's what gives us the adrenaline rush. And then the information goes via the neurons down to the adrenergic receptors to, for example, constrict peripheral blood vessels to increase your blood pressure, increase your heart rate, etc. And then on the other side, you have cortisol, which is a very important ongoing stress response. And that's triggered by initially the corticotropin releasing factor going to the pituitary gland, and then eventually to the adrenal cortex with the release of cortisol. And cortisol is an important way of measuring the stress response. This is just an image that very accurately indicates the fight or flight and the relaxed state of the parasympathetic nervous system. The adrenaline rush is a very important part of the sympathetic nervous system, and there are some effects of the important release of adrenaline. Cortisol contribution, it basically, I like the analogy where the sympathetic nervous system with the production of adrenaline puts the foot on the accelerator of the fight or flight response or the response to stress, and the cortisol is one way of keeping the foot on the accelerator. And then as the threat passes, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over and puts the brake on and dampens the stress response. Stress in macropods, although it's a very important cause of death in macropods, there's really not a lot of research or knowledge about stress. Usually in animals that we see here, our main stressors are the fence hangers, or in 2017 and 2019-20, there was the two big fires that we treated burns cases from. We also do rescue a number of animals that have been chased by dogs or motor vehicles. And of course, other big causes of stress in macropods are, especially in joeys, is separation. So separation from their mother or illness. Some triggers are more subtle for stress. It can be just sudden noises, strange noises, separation from a carer, moving to a release site. So there are less obvious stressors that are very important in the triggering the stress response in macropods. Personality, we all know that our animals have personality, and you can have very relaxed animals and then you have others that are very prone to anxiety. So the personality of the animal also plays an important part in the effect of stress and their response to stress. Measuring stress, we have looked at cortisol. Now, there are a number of ways of measuring cortisol. There are some that are less invasive, but they're not as useful because they do require an animal to be in care or to be monitored, so that, for example, with the fecal, you have to monitor animals so that you can collect the sample from the identified animal. The cortisol data we have has come from blood samples that were taken to look at biochemistry. And just another concept that I'd like to just talk about briefly is this exertional rhabdomyolysis. So when we get animals that have been chased by dogs or caught in fences, the exertion is extreme and often prolonged. And in summer, it's made worse by the particularly hot conditions that we get around here. And with this extreme exertion, you get breakdown of the muscle tissue. And this releases a muscle protein called myoglobin and enzymes such as CK, AST, ALT, and potassium in the blood. The myoglobin is particularly important because that's what causes the renal damage that can cause renal failure several months down the track, and would have been what caused the death of my first precious Joey Dasher after she'd been chased by the dogs. The creatine kinase is very useful, as it is a useful assessment tool. So when the biochemistry is done, the CK is a good indicator of how much muscle damage has occurred. And potassium is important as well, because potassium is a killer. It can cause a cardiac arrest if the potassium is very high. And just as an observation, myoglobin causes a dark brown urine. So you may have heard people talk about Coca-Cola coloured urine that you see after severe strenuous exercise and consequent exertional rhabdomyolysis. We've got some data from 3 classes of animals, or 3 groups of animals. In 2017, and there was a big fire in this area, and we looked after a number of burnt animals. And again, in 2019 and 2020, we looked after a number of animals in the Monaro area. And that's what triggered off the us to be asked to set up this triage centre and wildlife hospital, because we looked after a very large number of animals in the Monaro area. And a big interest here, because we are in prime kangaroo habitat, lots of rural residential areas with many fences. We get so many kangaroos that are caught in wire fences. Just recently, we had, just on one occasion, we had 40 fence hangers in care at the one time. And we also, again, because we're in rural residential area, do get a number of animals that have been chased by dogs. And biochemistry is useful in the care of these animals. And we have cortisol data that we started to look at as an indicator of stress levels in these animals. The first group is just a small group of animals that we treated in the Black Summer bushfires. These are a group, this is just a small number, or a selection of the animals. They're all animals that came here directly from the fire ground. So we rescued them and brought them here. We did get animals later on that came from other triage centres that had to shut down, and the animals were going to be euthanized. So our vet, Dr. Shen, thankfully offered to look after these animals, and they came here for care. But these are ones that we actually rescued, so they came straight from the fire ground. And just a couple of things that I want to mention here was Steph. Steph is a very relaxed girl, and when we found her, it was the second day that we'd been at the fire ground. When we arrived, we put out food and water bowls because there was only a mud puddle left in the dam on the fire ground at Two Thumbs Wildlife Sanctuary. And Steph was just lying next to the water bowl. All the water was gone. Everybody had come in for a drink, and her little Joey, Louisa, was standing by. So Steph had her Joey with her, and we feel that that helped reduce Steph's stress. She had her Joey with her, even though she had badly burnt feet. Cinders and Sparkles were two special girls. As we left the fire ground on a couple of days, as we were leaving, we noticed two girls were hobbling around in a grassy area just down from where there was a plane crash. So a firefighting plane crashed just near the fire ground at Calandon Sanctuary on the 23rd of January 2020. And Cinders and Sparkles were in that area, so possibly their burns were contributed by the consequent fire. Cinders had the worst burns, but again, their cortisol wasn't markedly elevated. It was elevated, but it wasn't markedly, and their CKs were not particularly elevated. And this is the thing that we noticed with our fire victims. Their CKs were actually not very high at all. Kenny was a very big male. He would have been at least 50 kilo, and he did very well coming. He had been here before, so he came back home, and he had very bad burns up the back of his legs. The leather was hanging off, but he was still hobbling around. But he was with some of the animals that he knew on the fire ground. Shannon was a particularly sad case because she was found before we could get into James's sanctuary, James Fitzgerald's Calandon Sanctuary. We rescued Shannon near Numaralla, and it was the German disaster response group that found, they saw Shannon there, and they reported her to us so we could go out and dart her. And she was all alone in this fire ground, absolutely nothing left, just black and brown. And I and the darter were looking for her, could not find her. And then I was chopping up fruit and sweet potato because there was one little grassed area where they had seen some redneck wallabies. And I noticed a movement just out of the corner of my eye. And it was poor old Shannon. She just got up and tried to hobble away. So she was all on her own in a fire ground for, several days after the fire, probably no access or limited access to any fluids at all, and her cortisol was particularly high. Cinders' story, just quickly about Cinders. Cinders had the worst burns cases, and or one of the worst burns cases, and she's done very well. She's had Joey's each year, and she's thriving at Possumwood. So just to quickly, because I'm going over time here, observations from the burns case data. They have quite high cortisol, but the CKs were not very high. They were all housed here in a double garage and 3 rooms. They were housed inside with animals with burns, and they were allowed to wander around in this enclosed area. And this cortisols dropped quite quickly in this very relaxed environment. They weren't housed outside. They weren't put in cages on their own. They were housed inside and were allowed to socialise. The wire fence entanglement data is quite different. You can see just briefly looking at some of those. Basil, for example, his CK was 731,000. So that's an enormous CK. He had a very severe exertional rhabdomyolysis. And some of those animals that died, for example, Kelly, it was difficult to know whether he was already going into shutdown when he was rescued or whether his death resulted not long after coming into care due to the biochemical abnormalities that would have resulted from his prolonged, he was a very prolonged fence entanglement. So just from this wire fence entanglement data, basically what we've observed is quite high cortisols, and the CKs are there's quite a wide range depending on the duration of the entanglement. But William, for example, his mum was around. He was only 10 kilo. He wasn't in the fence long. His CK was relatively low, really, and his cortisol was elevated, but not as high as some of the others. For example, Ginny, who was a very prolonged fence entanglement. So with Basil, Steve will talk about Basil later on. He had extremely high CK and cortisol level, but he's doing very well. And there is some information that Steve will talk about with respect to the polyvagal theory with Basil. So observation from the fence hanger data is that, in summary, basically CK and cortisol are markedly elevated. You can get them through even a very prolonged and severe exertional rhabdomyolysis with fluid therapy is the critical factor, metabolic acidosis treatment if needed, and then wound cleaning and antibiotic cover are also very important for the recovery. But one of the most important things to get them through is the rehab conditions. And this again relates to the polyvagal theory that Steve will talk about a bit later in the talk. Dog attack victims, again, they can have, depending on whether it was a prolonged chase, they can have a very high CK and usually a very high cortisol. Just looking at those. Carrie, for example, she was a fence hanger who was also attacked by a dog, the poor darling. She had a very bad wound in her neck. She's done very well. She's released, has had joeys, but her CK was 356 and her cortisol was 525, as you would expect from a prolonged fence entanglement, as well as a dog attack. There's just some data there from Cherry Blossom, who jumped into a Maremmering enclosure, unfortunately. Luckily, she was rescued by the property owner very quickly, but she did have a very high CK, 139,000, but very quickly that came down to, you can see only about 3 weeks later, it was down to 705. And Cherry Blossom did well and is now released. And part of her recovery was due to her recovery conditions where she was housed and the carers that she had. So this is just a bit of information about our dear Carrie. You can see the picture, the photo there of her with one of her joeys. Probably just move on from Swallow. Swallow is another example of a very severe dog chase and attack. And so these are another example of the markedly elevated, just like the fence hangers with the elevated CK cortisol. So severe exertion and severe fear and anxiety combined. Now, so just in summary from our 23 years of looking after animals that have been or experienced, survived severe trauma, whether it's fires, dog attack, fence entanglement. A lot of these animals were able to get them to switch from the fight or flight response that they experience during their trauma to the parasympathetic system, which is the rest and digest stage. And those animals do well and are released. However, over the years, we've noticed another smaller group of animals where we just cannot seem to get them out of fight or flight. Two examples are Maguli and Iggy. And these animals are very similar to PTSD in humans. We've tried with these animals different housing situations, different animals they were with to try and calm them down. So if you have we have some very calm animals that reside here, and they are very calming influence on other animals. But these animals, we just could not seem to get them out of their vigilant state. It was like their sympathetic nervous system was just switched on permanently. And this category are very prone to a situation where as another stress, and it can be even a minor stress. In the case of Iggy, it was just she was out in what we call our front enclosure, the creche area. A bird squawked, all the animals ran, and she ran with them, and then they all settled down. And then it happened again 10 minutes later. And on this occasion, Iggy just went round and round the enclosure calling. I managed to grab her, and she died in my arms about half an hour after that second stress. But the other thing that we find more perplexing with our animals that we've rescued after they've been exposed to trauma is this shutdown, which is this relentless decline in vital signs. It's like their body is shutting down and they're dying, even though they don't want to die. So they start to, you can detect it early by the animal starts to look apathetic. Their food and water intake tends to slow. They tend to sleep more. They lie down more. Just total apathy and disinterest. And we've called it shutdown. In the polyvagal theory that Steve will discuss, they call it immobilization. And you just see this relentless decline in heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, temperature. And I've held a number of these animals in my arms as they've died, and they basically just stop breathing. So it's a respiratory rest that they die from. So I've just talked about little Iggy. She was a highly stressed creature, little creature. She was only tiny. When she was rescued, a mother had been shot by a ranger, an injured mother had been shot by the ranger, and she'd been left there on this nature park. And by the time we got her, she'd been chased by dogs and on her own for several days. And she just never recovered from the trauma of that prolonged triggering of her sympathetic nervous system. So Steve is now going to talk about the polyvagal theory, which we've found is it's a theory that we'd like to throw out there for discussion, a way of explaining why these animals do go into what we call shutdown or immobilized state.
Yeah, so we came across the polyvagal theory a couple of years ago when I did a rescue of a small kangaroo that had been chased by dogs into a gate and suffered some spinal issues. Incidentally, the animal made a full recovery in the end after a lot of therapy. Talking to the owner of the property, who was a child psychologist, we came around to this theory by Stephen Porges, and it just seemed to fit all our observations over previous years. As Rosemary's talked about, there are two elements of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, under the Porges polyvagal theory, the parasympathetic nervous system is divided into two nervous systems called the vagal nerve, and that is a dorsal vagal nerve and a ventral nerve. And these have different roles. We'll come to that in a second. In terms of any other studies that have been done with animals using the polyvagal theory, that we've only come across one, and that's to do with horses. But this is a bit of a schematic on what this polyvagal theory and how it works with the autonomic nervous system. So, as Rosemary said, with the sympathetic nervous system, it's mobilizing.
So, Steve, you're running out of time, so you've got about a minute left, I believe.
We've got a minute left. So, that's not anywhere near enough, I think, to complete this. But basically, you can look at this as a ladder. The Sympathetic nervous system is about a mobilizing set of behaviors. You can either go up to a safe, social and engaged situation, or you can fall into what we've called shutdown, where you can just become numb, collapsed and shut down. I won't talk about neuroception, I don't think, but it's part of the theory, the polyvagal theory. Again, it fits very closely with what we've noticed. An example of the fight and flight sympathetic nervous behavior. This particular animal, Luna, she again recovered because she had one carer only. It was housed inside, and that one carer worked with her, and she made a full recovery. Some examples on the rest and digest. Ventral vagal nervous system under the autonomic nervous system. These animals look quite relaxed and comfortable here. They're either lying down in the sun, or they're practicing their boxing or whatever it might be. Here's some examples of shutdown. The one on the left, Mike, he in fact came from one of the triage centres. He came and he was in a very poor condition, and he had been treated pretty poorly in all the time that he was in that particular situation.
I'm sorry, Steve and Rosemary, we've